Our last video on Canada Post sparked a lot of conversation. And honestly, that's a great thing. People care. Some said Canada Post is outdated and should just go private. Others called it a lifeline that must be protected. And in all that noise, one question kept coming up. What's true? What's exaggerated? And what's being left out of the conversation? The truth is, both sides raise fair points. But there's also a lot of misinformation, speculation, and missing context. So today, we'll do our best to make sense of it all and see what really holds up. We'll unpack the biggest claims, from Canada Post is obsolete to the union's the problem, and look at what's myth, what's fact, and what deserves more context. Because when a public service is on the line, everyone deserves more than sound bites. We deserve the full picture. Claim 1. Canada Post is outdated and home delivery isn't needed. People love to say Canada Post is outdated because if you personally don't get much mail, the whole service must be useless, right? But that's a limited view, one that misses how millions still depend on it. Small businesses shipping orders, rural towns getting essentials, and people receiving prescriptions or government documents that can't just go digital. Yes, traditional mail has dropped by over 60% since 2006, but parcel delivery has grown significantly. And while Canada Post has about 75% of addresses already using community mailboxes, parcel lockers and slots fill up fast, meaning carriers still make door deliveries every day. So the idea that switching the last 25% to mailboxes will suddenly save Canada Post? That's optimistic at best. Canada Post and the government have said that people with disabilities will continue getting door delivery, and that's good. But the bigger concern is what happens after that. If the system keeps weakening, what guarantee is there that even those protections won't erode, or that private couriers would ever take them on? And here's where it gets interesting. When Canada Post struggles, Purolator, which Canada Post owns 91% of, seems to benefit. Several Canada Post executives, including CEO Doug Ettinger, also sit on Purolator's board, highlighting how closely the two companies are intertwined. During labor disputes and strikes, Purolator has reportedly offered discounts to businesses and hired gig workers to handle the surge, effectively undermining the union workforce. Gig workers, by the way, are great for corporations. No benefits, no job security, no union protections. Not so great if you care about stable, fair jobs in your community. So no, Canada Post isn't outdated. It's being quietly reshaped from a universal public service into a corporate logistics arm that acts more and more like its private competitors. What's really outdated is treating public services like businesses. We don't call hospitals or highways unprofitable. We call them necessary. We don't talk about how much money we lose on services, but how much is spent or invested. Maybe mail, the thing that keeps remote communities connected, deserves the same logic. Claim 2. Canada Post workers are greedy. Look at those wage demands. A lot of people see 22 to 24% wage hikes in the headlines and instantly roll their eyes. Sounds huge, right? But that's over 4 years, which works out to around 5 to 6% per year. In other words, roughly keeping pace with inflation. Canada Post's offer as of May 2025 is just over 13% compounded over 4 years, nearly half of the demand. When your grocery bill's up 20% since 2021, that's not a windfall, that's survival. Postal workers' wages vary widely. Median salaries vary by source, but fall roughly between $45,000 and $50,000 per year for full-time rural suburban mail carriers, with higher earners reporting roughly $75,000 annually. Yes, there's a pension and job security, but also physical strain, dog bites, brutal winters, and routes that don't get shorter just because the mail volume did. And sure, some people look at those numbers and think, that's more than I make. But that's kind of the point. It's not that postal workers are paid too much, it's that the average Canadian isn't paid enough. Fair wages in one sector shouldn't be the exception. They should be the benchmark we fight to raise everywhere else. About that claim that mail is down, why do they need the same number of workers? It's only half true. Letter mail is down, yes. But parcel delivery has skyrocketed thanks to e-commerce. New addresses are added every year, and rural routes have gotten longer, not shorter. So the work didn't vanish. It just shifted. And modernization? The union's not opposed to it. They've supported things like better route planning, expanded parcel services, and tech upgrades. The real friction isn't change versus no change. It's who pays for change and who benefits from it. Yes, the union's demands are big, but they're not unreasonable. For example, the union has requested that prescription sunglasses be covered in the benefits plan, a practical need for workers exposed to long hours outdoors, not a frivolous perk. And maybe we've just been conditioned to think that asking for wages that actually cover the cost of living is greedy, that expecting paid leave, benefits, and stability is too much. But if your reaction to that is anger, maybe it's not the workers you should be mad at, but the system that convinced you those things shouldn't be normal. Because the real problem isn't that some people are demanding more. It's that the rest of us aren't demanding enough. Claim 3. The billion-dollar loan in Livingston International. Okay, this one's not exactly a myth or fact, but it's a topic that deserves more attention. In January 2025, the federal government provided Canada Post with a repayable loan of just over $1 billion, a lifeline to keep the struggling Crown Corporation afloat. And this loan was framed as a way to stabilize the service while longer-term solutions were explored. Fast forward just over a week later, and Purolator, Canada Post's private courier subsidiary, announced it had acquired Livingston International, the country's largest customs brokerage. On paper, this makes sense for Purolator's growth strategy, expanding cross-border logistics, increasing efficiency, and strengthening its foothold in global trade. But the timing? That's what has people talking. Some observers have asked, were public funds meant to support Canada Post's struggling operations indirectly used to fund a private acquisition? And while there's no evidence of wrongdoing, the sequence of events looks, at the very least, suspicious. This is one of those situations where facts and speculation intersect. The loan exists, the acquisition exists, the timing is undeniable. But whether there's intent to benefit Purolator at the expense of the public service, we can't prove. What we can say is this: the optics are bad, and Canadians have every right to demand transparency and accountability. At the very least, these events highlight the urgent need for oversight when public money, private subsidiaries, and strategic acquisitions collide. And by the way, those government loans? That's a whole other debate. Some say Canada Post should just be funded like any other service anyway. Others say, don't use my tax dollars for mail I don't send. But here's the thing. We could easily fund it, and a lot more if we crack down on tax evasion and avoidance by the ultra-rich, which federal estimates say costs Canada tens of billions every year. Close a few loopholes, and suddenly the math works. But that's a whole other story for another video. Claim 4. Privatization would make things cheaper. People say, if Canada Post can't compete, just privatize it. Companies will do it better and cheaper. It sounds logical, until you look at what's happened everywhere that logic's been tried. Take the UK, where Royal Mail was privatized in 2013. Stamp prices have gone up repeatedly in recent years, and regulators have repeatedly flagged service problems. Ofcom has fined Royal Mail for failing to meet delivery targets. That's what efficiency looks like when profit becomes the priority. Or Germany, where Deutsche Post, DHL, operates in a partially privatized and regulated market. Germany's regulator set new postage price guidelines for 2025 to 2026 that allow significant increases, and complaints about delivery have climbed. The pattern there shows price pressure plus rising customer complaints, not the tidy savings a privatization pitch promises. The pattern's the same. Privatization doesn't reliably make mail cheaper for people. It tends to shift costs onto customers, weaken universal obligations, and relax standards. And for rural or remote communities, that often means no service at all, because private companies only go where profit margins make sense. Now, none of this means Canada Post doesn't need reform. It does. But there's a difference between modernization and marketization. One upgrades a public service to meet changing needs. The other sells it off and calls the fallout innovation. So when someone says privatization will make things cheaper, the honest answer is cheaper for who? Claim 5, Canada Post is inefficient because of unions. Every time Canada Post reports a loss, someone says, see, the unions are dragging it down. Because obviously the problem can't be management, government policy, or underfunding. It's always the people actually doing the work. Here's the thing. Yes, Canada Post has a large unionized workforce. And yes, that comes with collective bargaining, benefits, and pensions. But that's not inefficiency. That's stability. According to Canada Post's own annual reports, labor costs have remained a fairly consistent share of total expenses for many years. The real cost increases come from modernization delays, rising parcel handling costs, and aging infrastructure. In other words, the inefficiencies aren't coming from the unionized workforce. It's the systems, not the staff. And ironically, many of the modernization ideas being discussed, things like postal banking, expanding parcel hubs, and electric vehicle fleets, came from the union CUPW, not from executives. They've been proposing for years that Canada Post diversify its services instead of just cutting them. But instead of investing in those ideas, management often turns to service reductions and temporary staffing cuts to look efficient on paper, which might save short-term dollars but undermines long-term sustainability. It's also worth noting that inefficiency looks different depending on what metric you care about. If you're measuring profitability, sure, a universal mail carrier looks less efficient than Amazon. But if you're measuring accessibility, public value, and equity, then Canada Post still delivers, literally, to every corner of a country that's the second largest in the world by landmass. That's not inefficient. That's what a public service looks like. So when critics say, the union is the problem, what they often mean is, the union makes it harder to cut costs by cutting people. And maybe that's the point. Maybe protecting stable, middle-class jobs, pensions, and labor rights isn't the problem to fix. It's the thing worth keeping. So there you have it. The noise, the myths, and the facts behind the Canada Post conversation. The truth isn't always the soundbite version or comments you read online. It's more complicated, more important, and it affects all of us. Public services like Canada Post aren't just businesses. They're part of the fabric of our communities. The future of essential services like Canada Post matters. If we let it erode, it sets a precedent for what we'll accept in our communities. Standing up for workers and services now strengthens our ability to defend other essential systems, including healthcare. But that's a video for another day. I want to hear from you. Did I misrepresent anything? Did I leave out something important? Or maybe you have stories about how Canada Post affects your community, good or bad. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you found this breakdown useful, consider liking, sharing, or subscribing. It really helps these topics reach more people who care about public services and accountability.